You couldn't satisfy her, man. That's why she came to me. My best friend Tyler sneered across the bar, his words sharp as broken glass, cutting through the bass-heavy music and the laughter of the Friday night crowd. And in that instant, every face that turned toward me seemed to burn with the same half-shocked, half-delighted smirk you see when someone trips in public and eats pavement. And I remember the way the bartender froze mid-pour. The way two college kids at the pool table whispered something I couldn't quite hear, but knew was about me. And the way my girlfriend, no, not my girlfriend, looked away like she'd just seen something ugly on the floor. And I felt my throat dry up even though my hand still clutched a sweating bottle of Bud Light like it was supposed to anchor me in this storm of humiliation. And I know what you're thinking, maybe I misheard him. Maybe it was a bad joke. But no, I heard every word and so did everyone else. And before I tell you how the room tilted and my world split open, let me drop this line for you. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Because if you stick with me, you'll see why this wasn't the end of me, why it was just the beginning. And I should probably introduce myself. My name's Michael Hayes. I'm 36 years old, born and raised in Columbus, Ohio, son of a steelworker and a nurse. And I've spent the better part of my life trying to balance work, bills, family dinners, gym sessions, and the occasional escape into Sunday football, which probably makes me sound like 100 other guys you've met, but that's the point, right? I'm not extraordinary. I'm the type of man who shows up, who takes the weight no one else wants, who keeps the lights on even when the hours grind you down, and maybe that's why what Tyler did hit me the way it did, because he wasn't just my best friend, he was the one guy who was supposed to have my back when the rest of the world tried to put me down, and instead he chose the cheapest way to cut me. I'll admit something right here though, something I didn't tell a soul that night, not even my brother when he tried to pull me away before I swung at Tyler. I already had an ace up my sleeve, a detail so small Tyler overlooked it, something he would never see coming, and it's the kind of thing you learn to hold on to when you've been betrayed. Because revenge isn't about fists and bars. It's about patience, about letting the knife sit in your pocket until the right moment to flip it open, and I swear to you, that moment was coming. But that night, standing there in front of a dozen strangers and people I thought were friends, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about the look on Jenna's face. Jenna, the woman I'd been with for 5 years. The woman I'd bought a ring for just 2 months ago. The ring still sitting in my sock drawer, wrapped in a receipt from Jared's. And you want to know the most humiliating part? Tyler knew about the ring because I told him, drunk one night over wings and Miller Lights, about how I finally felt ready to make that move, and he patted me on the back like a brother, told me I was doing it right, all while he was already sneaking into her bed behind my back. And when I replayed that memory in my head standing in that bar, I swear my stomach turned like I'd swallowed bleach. I didn't hit him though. You probably think I did because that's what men do in these stories. They swing, they brawl, they break a nose to reclaim some dignity. But no, I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me snap. Because the thing about betrayal is it doesn't deserve a reaction in the moment. It deserves a reckoning, and if there's one quote you take from me, let it be this. The loudest revenge isn't a punch thrown in a bar, it's the silence before you close the trap. Still, I won't lie. The ride home that night was brutal. The silence in the cab louder than Tyler's words, and the driver's little glances in the mirror told me he knew I was that guy, the one who just got publicly wrecked. And when I walked into my apartment, the first thing I noticed was Jenna's perfume lingering in the air, like it was mocking me. That sweet vanilla lavender scent that used to calm me now felt like poison in my lungs, and I did something stupid. I went to the fridge, cracked open a bottle of Buffalo Trace I'd been saving for a special occasion, and drank straight from the neck until the world blurred. And I thought about my dad, how he always said, "Son, a man's worth isn't measured by how he stands tall, it's measured by what he does when he's on his knees." That stuck with me because I knew I was on my knees in that moment, crawling through the wreckage of trust, pride, and love. But somewhere in the haze of whiskey and heartbreak, I also knew Tyler and Jenna had overlooked something important, something they couldn't take from me no matter how much they tried, my discipline, my memory, my ability to play the long game. You see, I've spent years grinding my way up in finance, nothing flashy, just steady work in corporate accounting. But the thing about living in spreadsheets is you learn to see patterns, you learn to trace back trails that other people think are invisible. And Tyler, for all his charm and barstool bravado, was careless, sloppy, and entitled in ways that made him vulnerable. And though I couldn't quite put my finger on it that night, I felt it deep down. He'd made mistakes I could use, he'd left digital footprints in places he didn't realize I knew how to look. That was the seed, the whisper of the future. But at the time I was still drowning, still piecing together how 5 years of loyalty had been bulldozed by the two people who were closest to me. And it's funny, because earlier that same day I'd been texting Jenna about picking up Skyline chili on the way home, a dumb little tradition we had whenever one of us had a hard week. And I looked at that half-finished chili sitting in the fridge later, her handwriting on the post-it note saying, "Love you, be home soon." And I swear I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was proof that betrayal doesn't happen in some dramatic thunderclap. It happens in the middle of everyday routines, with chili in the fridge and a promise of love written in pink ink. And if there's another piece of wisdom I earned that night, it's this. The cruelest thing about betrayal is it doesn't erase the good memories. It poisons them, turns them into weapons you can't unsee. So yeah, I drank until I passed out on the couch, and when I woke up at 4 a.m. with the TV still glowing and the whiskey bottle half empty, I knew the old version of me was dead, and the new version, the one who would carry this scar like a brand, was just getting started. When the sun came up the next morning, it cut across my apartment like a knife. Every streak of light carving through the blinds and landing on the clutter that suddenly felt like evidence of a crime scene, the empty bottle of Buffalo Trace tipped on its side, the crumpled post-it note with Jenna's pink handwriting still stuck to the fridge, and my phone buzzing on the coffee table with a string of texts from Tyler that I couldn't bring myself to open. And I just sat there staring at that screen like it was taunting me because the rational part of my brain knew those messages weren't apologies. Not really. They'd be half-assed excuses wrapped in the same smugness he wore in the bar, and I wasn't ready to read his words and let the humiliation replay all over again. But I knew I couldn't hide forever, not in a world where everything is documented, screenshotted, passed around in group chats, because sure enough, when I finally dragged myself to the gym later that morning trying to sweat out the poison, I felt eyes on me, whispers traveling faster than the squeak of sneakers on the basketball court. And one guy I knew from high school actually had the nerve to come up while I was benching and say, "Hey man, rough night, huh?" Like my heartbreak was small talk. And I swear the weight bar almost slipped from my hands right then, crushing my chest. But I steadied it, racked it, and just gave him a look that shut him up, because if there's one thing I decided in that moment, it was that I wouldn't let anyone else narrate my downfall for me. I'd tell my own story, in my own way, on my own timeline. That thought became my anchor, weird as it sounds, almost like a mantra while I hammered out reps until my arms shook. And when I left the gym, the cold air slapped me across the face like it was daring me to wake up, to stop drowning and start swimming. And I realized something. Heartbreak makes you hypersensitive, every smell sharper, every sound louder, every memory heavier. And it was driving me insane because every damn thing in Columbus carried some reminder of Jenna and Tyler. The Skyline where we used to sneak beers on rooftops in college, the Buckeyes jersey Tyler wore to every game watch, the little coffee shop on High Street where Jenna loved the pumpkin muffins, and even though it felt like I couldn't breathe without bumping into their shadows, I also knew this was the same city that raised me, that built me, that taught me to survive when steel plants closed and neighborhoods emptied, and I wasn't about to hand it over to them like they owned the place. So I did what I always do when the world tries to knock me out. I went back to work, put my head down, buried myself in spreadsheets and financial reports, the kind of monotony that numbs the edges of pain. And for a while it worked. The hum of fluorescent lights, the clack of keyboards, the coffee burnt from sitting too long in the potit, all formed a cocoon around me. But then came the email, the one I'll never forget, because it was from Jenna, subject line, "We need to talk." And I swear my chest tightened like a vice. I didn't answer right away. I let it sit there in my inbox like a ticking bomb, but curiosity got the better of me after an hour, and when I opened it, there it was. She wanted to come by, grab her stuff, explain. And she had the audacity to sign it with love, like the word meant nothing, like it was punctuation. I didn't reply. Instead, I closed my laptop, walked across the street to the corner store, bought a pack of Marlboros, even though I hadn't smoked since college, and lit one outside in the freezing wind, coughing my lungs out but savoring the burn, because in that burn I felt something I hadn't in days control. And maybe that's the funny part of all this. Betrayal strips you down, but it also sharpens you. Makes you see the world for what it really is. No filters, no illusions. My dad used to tell me, "Don't confuse loyalty with blindness, Mike." And I think for the first time I actually understood him. That night when Jenna came by, she knocked soft like she didn't want to wake the neighbors. And I let her in, stood there with my arms crossed while she moved through the apartment like a stranger, pulling her dresses from the closet, her makeup bag from the bathroom. And every so often she'd glance at me like she was about to say something. But I stayed silent, let her sweat, let her feel the weight of my quiet. And finally she broke, said, "It just happened, Mike. I didn't mean for it to," and I cut her off with a laugh that scared even me. Because it wasn't the laugh of a man who thought anything was funny. It was the laugh of a man who'd seen the truth and decided to stop playing nice. "You didn't mean for it to?" I said, my voice low but sharp. "You don't trip and fall into someone's bed, Jenna. That's not an accident. That's a choice." She tried to cry, the tears sliding down her cheeks, and maybe once upon a time that would have cracked me, but now all I saw was a performance, a cheap act. And when she said, "Tyler loves me," I almost spat in disgust, because Tyler didn't love anything except attention and conquest, and I knew she'd learned it the hard way, but I wasn't about to save her from that lesson. Instead, I let her take her boxes, let her walk out without a fight, because here's the thing. You don't stop someone from leaving when they've already left you a long time ago. What you do is wait, watch, and plan, and when the time comes, you make sure they understand exactly what they threw away. That night, after she was gone, I sat on the couch with a fresh bottle of whiskey and that same stupid post-it note with "Love you, be home soon," and I made a promise to myself not to win her back, not to win Tyler's approval, but to win myself back, piece by piece, and then to take back everything they thought they stole from me. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I had something they didn't. Discipline, patience, and the kind of memory that catalogs every little slip, every receipt, every text, every carelessly left detail. And here's the part you'll want to remember, because it's the part Tyler forgot: betrayal always leaves a trail, and I already had the map. The strange thing about those first weeks after Jenna left was how quiet everything felt. Like the world had been turned down to low volume, but not in a peaceful way, in a suffocating way, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring and forces you to hear your own heartbeat. And I filled that silence with habits, some healthy, some not. Dragging myself to the gym at 6 a.m. like I was punishing my body for what my heart had done wrong, eating takeout every night because cooking for one felt like a joke, falling asleep on the couch with ESPN highlights looping until the screen burned into my eyelids. And every morning I'd wake up with that same thought pulsing in my skull. Tyler is walking around Columbus like he owns something that used to be mine, and every morning I had to wrestle with the urge to confront him, to storm into his apartment, or his job, or hell, even back into that same bar. But I didn't, because underneath the rage there was something colder growing, a discipline I didn't even know I had, a voice that said, "Wait, watch, collect." So I did. I started small, subtle, almost mechanical. I went back through old texts between Tyler and me, things we'd sent in late-night drunken banter or during workdays when we were both bored, and I began to notice little things I'd ignored before, like him bragging about cutting corners at work, slipping his boss's card into tabs at the bar, talking about how nobody checks the small stuff. At first I brushed it off as his usual swagger, but now, in the light of betrayal, it read differently, like clues left by a thief too arrogant to cover his tracks. And I knew then my angle wasn't through Jenna. She was a lost cause, a pawn who thought she was a queen, but through Tyler, because men like him always thought they were untouchable until paperwork and digital trails wrapped around their necks like a noose. Still, knowing I had a weapon didn't erase the pain of daily life, because betrayal isn't a wound that scabs over quickly, it's a poison that seeps. And I'd find myself standing in Kroger staring at the chili aisle with that post-it note flashing in my head, or catching the smell of lavender in a stranger's perfume and feeling like I'd been sucker punched. And in those moments, the temptation was to fold, to drown in whiskey, to vanish from the world, but instead I kept moving, one foot in front of the other, reminding myself of something my dad said once after losing his job at the mill. A man's dignity isn't in what they take from you, it's in what you refuse to let them destroy. So I refused. I refused to let Jenna's perfume or Tyler's smirk define me. I'd built a wall around myself brick by brick, and while people gossiped, while mutual friends chose sides, while coworkers whispered in break rooms, I stayed steady, which only made people underestimate me more, and that was exactly what I wanted. Then came the Christmas party. That's when the tension snapped into something sharper. It was the company party, ugly sweaters and cheap catering, in a downtown event hall. And of course, Tyler showed up, because of course he'd somehow charmed his way into doing some contracting work with one of our partner firms. And there he was, loud as ever, arm around Jenna, both of them decked out like they belonged in some Hallmark movie. And I knew people were watching me, waiting for the explosion, the scene, but I didn't give them one. Instead, I grabbed a plate of lukewarm meatballs, poured myself a whiskey from the open bar, and sat at a table with some guys from payroll, nodding along to their talk about the Browns' latest loss, and all the while I could feel Tyler's eyes darting over, waiting for me to crack, but I didn't, and maybe that's the first time he realized I wasn't going to play his game. Later that night, though, when I stepped outside for air, he followed, smirk still plastered on his face, cigarette glowing between his fingers, and he said, "You know, Mike, you could have just admitted you weren't enough for her, would have saved us all this drama." And I swear my knuckles ached with the need to break his jaw, but instead I smiled real calm and said, "You're right, Tyler, you win." And I walked away, leaving him with that confusion in his eyes, because men like him don't know what to do when you don't fight back. They feed off chaos, and when you deny them, that rattles them, makes them sloppy. And sloppy was exactly what I needed him to be. Over the next weeks, I started to pull threads, asking casual questions about the work he was doing with our partner firm, listening when coworkers griped about lost receipts or odd billing discrepancies, and slowly a picture started to form. One I wasn't ready to reveal yet, but let's just say Tyler had left fingerprints all over things he shouldn't have, and I tucked that away, feeding it like a secret flame in my chest. At the same time, I rebuilt myself piece by piece, started cooking again, just for me, hit the gym harder, cut back on the whiskey, even picked up running, though I hated every second of it, because I needed to feel like my lungs weren't just filled with smoke and bitterness. And you know what? People started noticing. Not Jenna, not Tyler, but the world around me, coworkers complimenting how sharp I looked, neighbors nodding at me in the hall, even strangers at the gym giving me that quick glance of respect when I racked plates without flinching. It wasn't validation, not exactly, but it was proof that I wasn't dead, that I wasn't defined by betrayal, and I think that scared Tyler more than anything, because the stronger I looked, the more his insecurity showed. He started texting me late at night, drunk ramblings that swung between bragging about Jenna and ranting about work stress, and I kept every single one, screenshotting them, backing them up, because one thing about betrayal is this: you don't waste the scraps, you turn them into ammunition. By the time New Year's rolled around, I knew part one of my story was closing, that I'd survived the humiliation, the heartbreak, the whispers, and now I was standing at the edge of something bigger, sharper, colder, a plan, a reckoning, a trap so quiet Tyler wouldn't even know he was in it until it snapped shut around him. And on New Year's Eve, when the clock hit midnight and the fireworks lit up downtown Columbus, I wasn't kissing anyone. I wasn't toasting champagne. I was standing on my balcony with a mug of black coffee in my hand, the bitter steam curling into the freezing air, and I whispered to myself, "This year you burn, Tyler. This year you learn." It's funny how quickly people move on when the gossip fades, how the same mouths that whispered about me at the bar and the Christmas party turn to new topics. Someone's divorce, someone else's DUI, and for the first time in months I walked into the office without feeling like eyes were drilling into my back. But just because the crowd moved on didn't mean Tyler had, and if anything, his arrogance grew bolder. Like the humiliation he served me wasn't enough. He had to keep reminding me of it, testing my patience. Maybe because deep down he sensed that my silence wasn't weakness. It was calculation, and men like Tyler can't stand the unknown. They thrive on reaction, and when they don't get one, they unravel. The unraveling started small. At first it was late-night texts, the kind that dripped with booze and insecurity. "She loves me, man. You'll see," or "I was always the one she wanted," and sometimes even, "You mad?" Thought we were brothers, and I never replied, not once. Because silence is louder than any insult, and each message told me more about his state of mind than he realized. Then came the work slip-ups, whispers that contracts he touched didn't add up, that clients complained about expenses logged twice, that someone saw him use a corporate card at Eddie George's bar and grill on a night he claimed to be traveling, and while others shrugged it off as sloppy accounting, I listened, collected, filed away. Because this is the thing about betrayal, it teaches you to look beneath the surface, to watch how someone eats, spends, talks, brags, and Tyler, for all his charm, had the subtlety of a sledgehammer, always flashing what he thought made him powerful, never noticing who was in the room. I remember one night in February, about 2 months after Jenna walked out, I was back at that same bar, sitting in a booth with a coworker after a long week nursing a beer, and Tyler walked in with Jenna on his arm, loud as ever, like he owned the place. And when his eyes landed on me, I swear he lit up, like he'd been waiting for this chance to perform. And sure enough, he strutted over, threw his arm around Jenna, and said, "Look at us, man, power couple, huh?" Like I was supposed to clap for him, and my coworker looked at me with wide eyes, ready for a fight. But instead I just raised my beer and said, "Congrats, Tyler. Don't screw it up like you always do." And the way his smile twitched told me I'd hit the nerve. Because here's something most people don't understand. Humiliation is a double-edged sword. It cuts deep, sure, but when you carry it long enough, it turns into armor, while the guy who thought he won ends up exposed, desperate to prove he's still on top. That was Tyler. The more I stayed calm, the more reckless he became, and soon enough even Jenna started showing cracks, her Instagram posts a little too curated, her smiles a little too forced, like she was trying to convince herself she'd made the right choice. And I watched it all from a distance, sipping coffee in the mornings, lifting at the gym at night, sharpening myself into steel while they dulled each other down. Then came the opening I didn't expect but knew how to use, March Madness. My company set up a bracket pool, $500 to the winner, and of course Tyler jumped in, bragging about his insider picks, making a show of it in the group chat, and I played along, joked with the guys. But behind the scenes I noticed something. The PayPal receipt for his buy-in came from an account tied to the very same corporate card people had been whispering about. Most folks wouldn't catch that, wouldn't care, but I did because I live in the details, and I saved that screenshot, filed it away with the others, knowing it was one more stitch in the net I was weaving. By April, the cracks were spreading faster. One night, a mutual friend texted me a blurry photo of Tyler at a casino in Indiana, chips stacked high, whiskey in hand, Jenna nowhere in sight, and the caption read, "Isn't he supposed to be in Chicago for work?" I didn't reply, but I saved that too. And here's where I'll drop another truth I've earned the hard way. Revenge isn't one grand gesture. It's death by 1,000 receipts. Every slip, every careless move, every brag, it all adds up, and by spring I had a folder on my laptop labeled only T that was thick with evidence. Duplicate expenses, bar tabs, texts, screenshots, photos, all painting the picture of a man drunk on his own lies. Still, I didn't move yet. Because timing is everything. And the sweetest revenge isn't about striking when you're angry, it's about striking when they think they're untouchable. And by summer, Tyler thought he was untouchable. He and Jenna were posting vacation photos from Myrtle Beach, him shirtless with a beer, her in oversized sunglasses with that same forced smile, and meanwhile the office chatter about his sloppy work grew louder, managers grumbling, HR poking around, and I knew my trap was nearly ready. But I kept my head down, played the loyal employee, the quiet ex, the guy who had moved on. But inside, every day, I felt the tension coil tighter, like a spring waiting for release, and I started to almost enjoy the wait, sipping my morning coffee like it was gasoline feeding the fire, reminding myself that patience wasn't weakness. It was the sharpest weapon I had. The thing about waiting is it makes you hyper-aware of the details. Like you start seeing every little thing not as random, but as part of a bigger picture, and by the time May rolled around, I wasn't just noticing Tyler's slip-ups. I was predicting them, almost like I knew the rhythm of his arrogance, the way a gambler knows when the dice are hot and when they're about to turn cold, and sure enough, the dice turned. It started when a client at work, a mid-sized logistics company out of Dayton, flagged an invoice that didn't match their records, and normally that kind of thing would get brushed off as clerical error, but I'd already seen enough to recognize Tyler's fingerprints, the same inflated numbers, the same duplicate entries, the same sloppiness, and I watched from my cubicle as emails started flying between accounting, management, and compliance. And Tyler, cocky as ever, tried to smooth it over with jokes and charm, which worked on some but not on me because behind the jokes was panic, and panic is a scent you can't hide. Meanwhile, Jenna was starting to show cracks in her perfect picture too. One night in June, I ran into her at Kroger of all places, both of us in the cereal aisle, and for a split second we froze like deer in headlights, and she gave this weak smile before saying, "Mike, hey, how are you?" Like we were casual acquaintances, not two people who once planned a future together, and I kept it polite, said, "I'm good, just grabbing some stuff." And I started to walk away, but she touched my arm, lightly, and her voice dropped when she said, "You know, he's been stressed. I don't know what's going on with him lately." I didn't take the bait, didn't ask, just nodded and said, "That's between you two," and walked off. But inside I felt this electric confirmation. Even she could feel it, the unraveling, the way his empire of lies was starting to rot from the inside. That night, I poured myself a coffee at midnight instead of whiskey, sat at my laptop, and opened the folder labeled T, scrolling through months of screenshots, receipts, texts, and it hit me that I didn't just have a collection of evidence. I had a case, the kind of airtight, undeniable paper trail that no charm or swagger could erase. And I knew exactly how to use it, not through fists, not through shouting matches, but through the very system Tyler thought he was gaming. Corporate America has one golden rule: paperwork wins. Doesn't matter if you're the loudest guy in the room, doesn't matter if you're sleeping with someone's girlfriend, if your receipts don't line up, you're done. And Tyler's receipts didn't line up. I started drafting a report, nothing flashy, just bullet points with attached files, a timeline of discrepancies, duplicate charges, bar tabs tagged to the wrong projects, PayPal receipts tied to company cards, even a few text messages where he bragged about writing off nights out as business dinners. And I saved it in 3 places on my laptop, on a flash drive, and on a cloud backup under a different name, because if there's one thing betrayal teaches you, it's redundancy. But I didn't send it yet. No, I wanted Tyler to hang himself a little further, to give me the one undeniable move that would make the news snap tight. And almost like fate, he did. In late June, the company threw a summer mixer at a rooftop downtown. Open bar, catered food, a DJ, the whole deal, and of course Tyler showed up, already a few drinks deep before sunset, and he made the fatal mistake of bragging too loudly, to too many people, that he was living like a king on company dime. I heard it myself, standing just a few feet away, his words slurred but clear, and I saw the way one of the VPs raised an eyebrow, the way another manager exchanged a look, and I thought, that's it, that's the nail. I didn't confront him, didn't gloat, I just finished my drink, slipped out early, and when I got home I added that moment to the report, time-stamped, detailed, one more thread in the net. And here's another piece of wisdom I'll give you, something I learned staring at those files. The difference between bitterness and justice is documentation. Most guys stew in their anger, drink themselves stupid, or throw punches that land them in jail. But if you can channel that rage into precision, into files and facts, then you hold something way more powerful than fists. You hold the system itself, and the system doesn't forgive sloppy men like Tyler. Meanwhile, Jenna kept reaching out in small ways, liking an old photo of mine on Instagram, sending a random text about a restaurant we used to go to, even stopping me again outside the gym one night to say, "I don't think he's who I thought he was." Her eyes rimmed red like she'd been crying, and maybe the old me would have softened, would have let her pull me into her storm. But not anymore. I just told her, "You made your choice," and walked past, coffee thermos in hand, gym bag over my shoulder, because here's the thing. Betrayal doesn't just change how you see others, it changes how you see yourself. And I wasn't the man begging for scraps of her attention anymore. I was the man who held the knife behind his back, waiting for the perfect moment. By July, I had it. Tyler submitted a travel reimbursement for a conference in Denver, flights, hotel meals, the whole thing. But I knew because of a mutual friend's Instagram story that he hadn't been in Denver at all that week. He'd been in Vegas. Drunk and loud, Jenna nowhere in sight, gambling chips stacked in front of him. And when I compared the timestamps, it lined up perfectly. The exact night he claimed client dinner in Denver, he was tagged in the background of a blackjack table at the Bellagio. That was the detail, the technicality, the overlooked truth that even Tyler couldn't charm his way around, and when I slid that into the report, labeled and cross-referenced, I knew the noose was ready. But still, I didn't send it, not yet. Because revenge, the kind that sears itself into memory, isn't about ending them quietly, it's about timing, about making sure they feel the trap close when they think they're at their peak. And Tyler wasn't at his peak yet. No, he still thought he was winning, still thought Jenna was his trophy and the company was his playground, still thought I was the quiet ex, nursing wounds in silence. And that was exactly where I wanted him. By August, the air itself felt heavy, like the kind of thick heat that makes tempers short and patience thinner, and I could see Tyler unraveling in real time, though he thought he was still invincible, the way a man on a high-rise ledge thinks he's safe until the concrete crumbles under his feet, and I swear there was a kind of poetry in watching him stumble without even realizing the ground was gone. He doubled down at work, bragging louder, pushing harder, padding his expenses with an almost suicidal confidence, as if the more he stole, the safer he felt, and in that arrogance, he gave me exactly what I needed, patterns so obvious even a blind auditor could follow. One morning, he walked into the office late, sunglasses on, grinning like he owned the place, slapped a stack of receipts on the assistant's desk, and I watched her glance at the top page with confusion before filing them into the system, her shrug saying, "Not my fight." But it was my fight, and when I peeked later, the receipts didn't even try to hide it anymore. Hotel stays in cities with no clients, luxury dinners on weekends, bar tabs marked team morale, and each one went into my folder, each one tightening the knot he couldn't see around his neck. And here's the cruel irony of betrayal. While Tyler was burning his own future with gasoline, Jenna was starting to walk through the ashes barefoot, finally realizing the fire she'd chosen wasn't warmth but destruction, and the sight of her unraveling too was its own strange justice. I ran into her again, this time outside a coffee shop downtown, and she looked tired, makeup smudged, hair pulled back like she hadn't bothered that morning, and when she asked, "Mike, can we talk?" there was a tremor in her voice that wasn't there months ago, the tremor of someone who thought they'd chosen gold but found rust instead. We sat on a bench, the smell of roasted beans drifting between us, and she whispered, "He's different lately, moody, secretive. I don't even know where he goes half the time." I sipped my black coffee, nodded, and kept my voice calm when I said, "Jenna, you chose him. You don't get to be surprised now." She flinched like the words were a slap, but she didn't argue, just stared down at her hands, and for a brief second I almost pitied her, but pity dies quickly when you remember the nights you sat alone while she laughed in someone else's car. That night, I updated the file again, reorganizing it so cleanly it could have been a prosecutor's exhibit, and I started drafting the email that would blow the whole thing open, attaching every document, every photo, every timestamp, with a subject line that would make any compliance officer sit up straight. Urgent. Expense report irregularities, Tyler H. But still I didn't hit send, because patience is what turns justice into poetry, and I wanted the timing to cut deepest. Then, as if the universe itself wanted to give me the perfect stage, Tyler himself set it up. The company announced a quarterly all-hands meeting in early September. Big conference room, full staff, a few VPs flying in from out of state, and I knew instantly that was the moment, the peak of his arrogance, the biggest spotlight, the place where one crack would echo loudest. Leading up to it, Tyler strutted around like a king about to deliver his coronation speech, talking about how he was in line for a promotion, dropping hints about big opportunities. And Jenna, I later learned, even posted a photo of him in a new suit with the caption "So proud," though the likes and comments felt thinner than they used to, as if even her friends had stopped believing the fairy tale. And me? I kept drinking my coffee, kept my head down, kept quiet while the storm built, knowing the file on my desktop was a loaded gun, and all I had to do was wait for the right second to pull the trigger. And here's a truth people don't talk about enough. Revenge isn't about anger, it's about timing. Anger makes you sloppy, but timing makes you sharp, and when you wait long enough, you don't just win, you end them. So in those final weeks, I polished every detail of the dossier until it gleamed, cross-referencing every date, every receipt, even printing a hard copy that I sealed in an envelope, because redundancy is survival, and when betrayal teaches you once, you don't forget. I even tested the waters by casually mentioning to a coworker in the break room, "Man, some people really push the limits with their expense reports." And when she laughed nervously and said, "Oh, you mean Tyler?" I knew the suspicion wasn't just in my head anymore, it was in the air, waiting for someone to give it shape. And I was ready to be that someone. By the time the calendar flipped to September, the pieces were set. Tyler at his loudest, Jenna at her weakest, the company at its most attentive, and me, the quiet shadow in the back row, with a file that could collapse everything he thought he built. That's how you close a trap. You let them think they're untouchable until the moment they're not, and when the floor drops out, it's not rage they hear, it's silence, the silence of inevitability. And I sat there in my apartment the night before that meeting, sipping coffee gone cold, staring at the email draft with my finger hovering over send, and I thought, tomorrow, it ends. The morning of the quarterly meeting, I woke up earlier than usual, not from nerves, but from the kind of stillness that comes when you've rehearsed 1,000 times in your head, and know the outcome is already written. And as I shaved and dressed, I kept thinking how ordinary the ritual felt for a day that would end someone's entire illusion. The company conference room was packed by 9 a.m. Rows of chairs filled with staff who smelled faintly of coffee and cologne, a few VPs from corporate up front, their polished suits broadcasting authority, and Tyler, of course, was at the center, beaming like the star of his own movie, wearing a charcoal suit that looked expensive but fit him like arrogance instead of class. I sat 3 rows back, quiet, the way I always had been, and it struck me that invisibility is a weapon. He never once glanced my way. Too caught up in the mirror, he thought the whole world held up for him. The meeting began with the usual updates, graphs and charts projected on the big screen. Polite claps here and there, and Tyler leaned back, legs crossed, nodding like the numbers existed because he approved of them. When it was his turn, he strutted to the podium, voice booming with rehearsed confidence, and started spinning a story about strategic initiatives, client growth, and expense management. And I swear the irony almost made me laugh. Expense management, from the man who bled the company like a parasite. As he spoke, I opened my laptop, the glow of the screen a small shield, and pulled up the email draft I prepared, attachments lined neatly like bullets in a chamber. My cursor hovered over the send button, and for a second I felt the ghost of hesitation. After all, this was the man, my brother, my blood, and there was a time I would have defended him to anyone. But then I remembered Jenna's laughter drifting out of that car, the late nights covering bills while they called me cheap, the look in my mother's eyes when she said Tyler was the real son, and suddenly hesitation wasn't even in the room anymore. I hit send. The email shot out like a flare into the night, landing in the inboxes of every VP, the CFO, the compliance officer, and even the general company account for good measure, because justice doesn't whisper, it echoes. The sound of Tyler's voice droned on for another 30 seconds before it happened. The CFO, a tall man with silver hair and sharp glasses, tapped at his phone, frowned, then whispered something to the VP beside him, who pulled out his laptop. Then another did the same, and within a minute a ripple of silence cut through the room like a blade. Tyler faltered mid-sentence, his confident rhythm breaking, and asked, is something wrong? But the CFO held up a hand, eyes narrowed, and said, Tyler, can you step aside a moment? The shift in the room was seismic. You could feel the air tighten, people leaning forward in their seats, whispers starting at the edges. I sat there, perfectly still, as Tyler's smile faltered into confusion, then indignation, his voice a notch higher when he stammered, I don't understand, I'm in the middle of… But the CFO cut him off with a tone that didn't invite debate. Now, please. Tyler stepped back, face flushed, eyes darting, and I watched his hands clench at his sides. A man used to control suddenly realizing the stage wasn't his anymore. The CFO turned to the room, voice even, professional, but edged with steel. We've just been made aware of significant irregularities in expense reports tied to this department. Effective immediately, we need to pause this presentation. Gasps rippled, heads turned, phones buzzed as people checked their inboxes, and Tyler spun around like a cornered animal, hissing, This is a mistake! A setup! Someone's trying to ruin me! But the evidence was already open on screens across the room: hotel receipts, bar tabs, luxury dinners, all stamped with his name, each one a nail hammered publicly into his coffin. And here's the thing, when truth arrives, it doesn't need volume, it just needs clarity. And clarity was everywhere in that room while Tyler's voice cracked with desperation. I caught a glimpse of Jenna, yes. She'd come, sitting near the back, phone in hand, her eyes wide as she scrolled through the very documents that showed her prince wasn't a king but a thief. For the first time, I saw her shoulders slump, as if the weight of her own choices had finally collapsed on her, and part of me wondered if she'd cry, but no tears came. Just the hollow stare of someone who'd bet everything on a bluff and lost. Security entered the room discreetly, 2 men in suits, and when the CFO quietly said, Tyler, we'll need you to come with us, I swear the silence was louder than any applause could have been. Tyler's face went crimson, sweat beading on his forehead, and in his panic he tried to turn it back, pointing a shaking finger at the crowd. You're all jealous. Every one of you. You've been waiting to drag me down, but I built this place. I carried it. His words fell flat, the kind of rant that feeds only itself, and nobody answered, nobody defended him, not even the friends who once orbited his glow. They just watched. And me? I sat still, heart steady, face unreadable, because revenge isn't about gloating, it's about silence. The silence of knowing the moment has landed exactly as you intended. As Tyler was escorted out, his voice echoing down the hallway in a mix of rage and pleas, the room slowly exhaled, the whispers swelling into a buzz, and the CFO cleared his throat, promising an immediate investigation, his tone clipped but composed. I closed my laptop, slid it into my bag, and stood quietly, walking past Jenna without a word. Though I saw her eyes flick toward me, recognition dawning, suspicion even, but I didn't break stride. Outside, the late morning sun hit my face, warm, indifferent, and I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't the shadow in the story, I was the one who ended it. And Tyler? He was just the echo of a man who thought betrayal had no consequences, now learning that it always does. The hours after the meeting were a blur for everyone else, but crystal sharp for me, because once the detonator is pressed, you see everything in fragments of reaction. The hushed conversations in hallways, the hurried footsteps of managers trying to understand how deep the rot went, the wide eyes of junior staff who suddenly realized the man they had envied for his easy charm had been nothing but a parasite in a tailored suit. Tyler was escorted out through the side entrance, his protests echoing faintly down the corridor, and within 30 minutes an all-staff email went out from the CFO announcing his administrative leave pending investigation, which was polite corporate code for "he's finished." Phones buzzed, text chains lit up. Employees who'd once fought for his approval now dissected his downfall with the glee of people who had always suspected but never had proof. And while all this churned around me, I sat quietly at my desk, typing up invoices, answering emails, keeping my face neutral, because the greatest revenge is to look untouched, while the fire consumes the one who tried to burn you. Mid-afternoon, I felt the weight of a stare before I saw it Jenna, standing at the edge of the open office space, eyes locked on me. She didn't look furious the way I'd expected. She looked fractured, like a mirror with too many cracks to count, clutching her phone as if it could still anchor her to the reality she wanted. When I finally lifted my gaze to hers, she mouthed, "Was it you?" And for a moment, I let the silence answer, because silence is a weapon sharper than any denial. She waited, swallowing hard, then walked over, heels clicking too loudly in the hushed space, and stopped at my desk, leaning in just enough that her perfume, the same one that used to fill my car when she rode with me before Tyler, drifted between us like a cruel ghost. "Tell me you didn't do this," she whispered, voice trembling but laced with desperation. I kept my eyes on my screen, scrolling through a spreadsheet, and said softly, evenly, "I don't know what you're talking about." Her breath hitched because she heard what I didn't say. She leaned closer, almost hissing now. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've destroyed him. You've destroyed everything." I turned then, finally meeting her gaze, and the look I gave her wasn't rage or triumph, but something colder, indifference. "No, Jenna," I said, my voice calm enough that the few coworkers within earshot paused to listen. "He destroyed himself. I just made sure the truth was seen." Her face crumpled in that instant, a mix of shame and realization, because deep down she knew I was right. She'd watched him swipe the company card, watched him brag about benefits of leadership, laughed along when he dismissed rules as something for smaller men, and in her silence, she'd been complicit. She tried to recover, squaring her shoulders, eyes flashing with some last shred of loyalty, but the edges of her confidence were gone. "You'll regret this," she spat under her breath, but it sounded hollow, more like something she wished was true than something she believed. I didn't respond. I simply turned back to my screen, the universal gesture of dismissal, and the moment stretched long enough that she finally stepped back, her heels retreating in sharp clicks that sounded almost like defeat itself. As soon as she left, I heard the whispers begin again, people piecing together that my calm wasn't ignorance but certainty, that maybe, just maybe, I'd been the hand behind the curtain. And the thing about whispers is they grow legs by the end of the day. At least 3 different versions of the story floated around. One where Tyler had been set up by jealous rivals, one where the CFO himself had caught him red-handed, and one, my favorite, where the quiet guy in accounting had finally had enough. I let them all breathe, feeding none, denying none, because ambiguity is power, and as long as people wondered, I remained untouchable. That evening, as the office emptied out, I walked past Tyler's office, his nameplate still on the door, though the blinds were shut, the desk inside already feeling abandoned, and I felt no pity, no satisfaction even, just clarity. This was what justice looked like in real time. Not cinematic fireworks, not dramatic confessions, but a man's reputation bleeding out slowly while everyone he once charmed stepped over him without hesitation. Outside, the parking lot was quiet, the sky painted in fading streaks of orange, and as I unlocked my car I saw Jenna again, standing near her sedan, arms folded, waiting. She called out, her voice carrying across the asphalt, "You think this makes you better than him? You think this erases what he did to you?" I stopped, hand on the door handle, and after a long silence I said, "No, Jenna. This wasn't about being better. It was about balance. And balance doesn't care about your excuses." Her shoulders slumped, her mouth opened as if to argue, but nothing came out, because deep down she knew balance had finally arrived, and it had no sympathy left for either of them. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove off without looking back, leaving her in the dying light of a story that was no longer mine to carry. The week after Tyler's removal was like watching a slow-motion implosion, the kind where each crack in the foundation echoes louder than the last until the entire structure caves in under the weight of its own arrogance, because first came the official memo from HR confirming his termination, for cause, which was the polite way of saying he would leave without severance, without references, without the golden parachute he had probably boasted about over-expensive scotch, and then came the freeze on his accounts pending audit, the very accounts he had once waved around like trophies when he'd bragged about handling big money like a real man. And within days, the whispers in the office spilled into the wider professional community. Because news like that doesn't stay locked behind corporate walls. It leaks, it spreads, it becomes rumor, then fact, then headline. And sure enough, by the following Monday, one of the local business journals ran a short but brutal piece. Rising star falls. CFO ousted amid misuse of company funds. His picture, the same polished headshot he used on LinkedIn, sat at the top of the article, smiling that smug smile that now looked grotesque against the weight of the words beneath it. I read the piece once, then closed the tab, because I didn't need to linger. The damage was already done. What interested me more was the ripple effect. His phone number, the one he used to parade around, went silent in group chats. His social media accounts that once overflowed with curated vacations and motivational quotes went dark. Friends who had orbited him for status began quietly unfollowing, distancing themselves, because no one wants to be tied to a sinking ship. And yet the collapse wasn't just professional, it was personal, because whispers reached me, carried by the same people who had once carried his gossip about me, that his parents were furious that the man they had called their golden son, their real success story, had been exposed not as a visionary but as a fraud, and worse, that the house he had been planning to buy, the one he had bragged about being 3 times bigger than mine, had fallen through because the bank pulled financing after the story broke. In less than a fortnight, the man who had strutted through life as though the world owed him applause was reduced to a ghost-haunting coffee shops, meeting with lawyers, begging old contacts for help, and every time his name surfaced in hushed tones at the office or in the neighborhood, people's lips curled not with sympathy but with a kind of cruel satisfaction, because arrogance breeds enemies quietly, and when you fall, they clap the loudest. And Jenna, she stayed, orbiting his wreckage like a satellite that couldn't break free, still driving his car to and from the office, still wearing the jewelry he had bought with other people's money, but her shine was gone too, because when colleagues looked at her now, they didn't see the ambitious professional she had tried to paint herself as. They saw a woman tied to a scandal, complicit by silence, and the weight of that judgment was visible in the way she avoided eye contact, the way her laughter had vanished from break rooms, the way her once confident stride had become a quiet shuffle. She tried once more to approach me, catching me in the lobby as I was leaving late one evening, her voice softer now, almost pleading, "You don't understand what you've started. He's losing everything. They're talking about pressing charges." I stopped, looked at her with the same measured calm I'd practiced all along, and said, "Then maybe it's finally fair," before stepping past her into the night, leaving her with the truth she didn't want to carry. And as the days blurred, I realized something important. Revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't fiery. It wasn't about shouting from rooftops or relishing in dramatic confrontations. Real revenge was quiet, patient, methodical. It was the slow unraveling of a man who had built his life on lies, and the silence of the one he wronged, watching, unbothered, untouched, as justice moved like gravity, inevitable and cold. The summons came faster than anyone expected, faster even than I thought it would, though I had counted every step along the way with the precision of someone who had lived through betrayal and learned that patience is a weapon sharper than any blade. Because 3 weeks after his termination, a federal investigation was formally announced. tied to misuse of corporate funds that crossed not just company policy but interstate banking laws, which meant this wasn't just about losing a job or a reputation anymore, it was about prison, and the weight of that word seemed to hang over every conversation in town. Every whispered update traded like currency among people who once cheered his rise, but now feasted on his ruin. And I remember sitting in my office when the first article broke. Headline bold and merciless. Former CFO under federal probe for fraud. Faces possible charges, with his name and face plastered like a warning to anyone who thought arrogance could outpace accountability. And while others gossiped, I sat in silence, scrolling once, twice, then closing the tab because there was nothing to add, no satisfaction to voice. It was already happening, the collapse completing itself in real time, and I needed only to witness. His parents, the ones who once looked through me as though I were invisible, the ones who told me Tyler was the real son, were now seen at the grocery store speaking in hushed voices, their shoulders hunched with shame, and the neighbors who once rushed to their parties now crossed the street to avoid conversation because scandal stains everything it touches, and their perfect son had dragged them down with him. Jenna, too, shrank into the shadows. She still worked in the same building, but her presence was spectral, her hair tied back with none of the flair she once paraded, her eyes cast downward, and when she passed me in the hall, she no longer tried to stop me, no longer sought explanations or relief, because even she knew now that the story had slipped beyond her reach, and the man she tied herself to was headed somewhere she could not follow without losing the rest of herself. And Tyler, what little I heard came from the same whispers he once fed to others, but instead of tales of my inadequacy, they told of his desperation, his calls to old contacts that went unanswered, his attempts to hire attorneys who laughed behind closed doors because his funds were frozen and his options limited, and his drinking, which had once been the accessory to his arrogance, now the crutch of a man crumbling in real time. I drove past his apartment once, not because I wanted to gloat, but because it was on my way home and I saw him through the glass lobby doors, unshaven, pacing, his phone in his hand, shouting at someone who wasn't listening. And in that moment, for the first time, I felt not pity, not forgiveness, but a strange stillness, as though the circle had finally closed, as though the world had realigned after years of imbalance. This was justice, not the theatrical kind that movies sell, but the cold, inevitable kind that moves slowly and without mercy, grinding down everything false until only truth remains. And the truth was simple. He had tried to erase me, to mock me, to strip me of dignity, but in the end, he erased himself, exposed himself, and the only role I played was patience, letting gravity do the work. The indictment came down in late November, the kind of news that doesn't just appear in headlines but lingers for days, recycled across every outlet. Each reporter savoring the spectacle of a man who once strutted through boardrooms, now reduced to a defendant standing stiff before a judge. And though I didn't attend the first hearing, I watched the footage later, his suit ill-fitted, his tie askew. The confident grin that used to precede every backhanded comment replaced by a tight-lipped grimace as the charges were read. Wire fraud, embezzlement, falsifying financial records, each word striking with the weight of years behind it, each syllable carving away at whatever image he had left of himself. And I realized, watching that video on mute in my living room, that there was no need for words anymore, because the silence of seeing him cornered was more powerful than any explanation he could ever offer. Reporters swarmed him outside the courthouse, microphones thrust like weapons, questions fired without mercy. Did you steal from your company? How much did you take? Do you regret betraying your investors? And he pushed past them, his eyes hollow, his jaw clenched, Jenna walking 3 paces behind like someone ashamed to be caught in his orbit. And I thought back to every gathering where they laughed at me, where they toasted his brilliance while treating me as an afterthought, and it struck me how quickly the script had flipped, how mercilessly the spotlight exposes weakness once it turns. His so-called friends, the ones who once filled his weekends with golf trips and whiskey nights, vanished, their silence louder than the cheers they once gave, and the same people who called him a visionary now called him a fraud, because loyalty built on greed dies the moment the well dries up. His parents stopped leaving the house altogether. Curtains drawn, yard neglected, invitations ignored, because the world they cultivated, one of superiority, of pride in their golden son, had collapsed into ridicule, and they couldn't bear the stares. And Tyler himself, stripped of title, of wealth, of respect, began to unravel in ways that made even the cruelest gossipers whisper with caution, because this wasn't just about prison anymore. It was about watching a man disintegrate before the sentence was even handed down. His skin pale, his voice frayed, his frame thinner each time he appeared in public, as though the weight of what he had done was consuming him from within. I never spoke a word to him during this unraveling, never extended a hand or delivered a line of condemnation, because my silence was the final act, my absence louder than his pleas would have been. And I think he knew it. I think he felt the weight of me not engaging, not acknowledging, because what greater revenge is there than to let a man choke on the ruin he built with his own hands? And as winter settled in, as his court dates stacked up and his name became a cautionary tale, I walked through the city lighter, freer, not because I celebrated his fall, but because I had finally released the burden of his shadow, finally lived a day without his voice echoing in my head, and in that clarity I understood something I hadn't before. Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it arrives dressed as inevitability, quiet, steady, unrelenting until the man who tried to bury you finds himself buried instead, with nothing left but silence and consequence. The sentencing came in early spring, months after the indictment, months of delays, filings, negotiations that all led to the same inevitable conclusion, and by then the city had already moved on in many ways, chewing on fresher scandals, fresher headlines, but for me, the date was etched into my memory like a milestone I had been walking toward in silence. And when the day arrived, I sat in the back of the courtroom, unnoticed, unseen, just another face among the crowd of journalists, former colleagues, and curious onlookers who wanted to witness the final act of a story that had once burned so brightly. And there he was, Tyler, thinner than ever, his hair grayer at the temples, his hands trembling as he gripped the table in front of him, no longer the man who laughed at me in boardrooms or mocked me at family dinners, but a hollow figure waiting to be measured by the weight of justice. The judge read the charges slowly, methodically, each one like a nail being hammered into a coffin, and when the sentence was finally spoken, 8 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole before serving at least 5, it landed with a stillness that filled the room. No gasps, no cheers, just a collective exhale, as though everyone present knew this was exactly what had been earned, exactly what balance required. He didn't look back when the bailiff cuffed him, didn't search the room for support, didn't seek out his parents, who were absent that day, too humiliated to watch the final collapse of their real son. And for a brief moment, as he shuffled forward, head down, chains clinking softly, I wondered if he thought of me. If he replayed the smug way he once told me I'd never measure up, if he realized that every cruel word, every slight, every betrayal had brought him here, not because I struck back, but because he never believed the rules applied to him. Jenna sat 2 rows ahead, her face drawn tight, her hands folded in her lap, and though I couldn't read her expression fully, I could sense the quiet resignation of someone who had bet her life on a man who could not even carry his own. And when the hearing ended, when the room emptied, she didn't linger, didn't look around, just slipped out the side door like a shadow desperate to disappear. And I let her go, because her story was hers to carry, and mine was finished. Walking out of that courthouse into the pale spring sunlight, I felt no triumph, no glee. None of the cinematic fire people imagine revenge to feel like, but instead a calm that sank deep into my bones, a calm born from the knowledge that justice, though slow, had arrived unshakably, and I hadn't needed to destroy him with my hands. He had destroyed himself with his choices. People sometimes ask me, years later, how I survived the betrayal, how I endured being humiliated, erased, mocked by someone who seemed untouchable, and I tell them the truth. I endured by waiting, by refusing to let bitterness consume me, by trusting that arrogance always digs its own grave, and in the end, that grave is deeper than anything I could have carved myself. I don't hate him anymore. I don't feel anything at all when I think of him. And that, perhaps, is the real victory, not that he is in prison, not that his name is ruined, but that I am free of him, free of the shadow he once cast over my life. And as I close this chapter, as I look toward the years ahead, I carry with me the simplest, coldest lesson of all. Betrayal can wound, but silence and patience can bury, and the world has a way of balancing its scales without mercy, until every man is forced to face the truth of who he really is. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. It helps us share more true stories like this.